Let me ask you this. Your book took 10 years to write, and you had to work it around your busy schedule, working in fashion. So that's a big commitment. And I heard you say somewhere also that you didn't even particularly mind if it was published. So I wondered, what was the drive in you to get this story out on paper?
Yeah, it did. It took 10 years to write. And for most of that time, it was a personal project. I began it not necessarily as a conscious thought. I didn't have any idea of what I was trying to achieve. It was just a series of feelings and emotions that I wanted to express. And the book came out really quite quickly at the very beginning for the first draft, but the first draft was about almost 1,600 pages long. So it was this absolute monster. But I I really allowed the characters. I was thinking about this mother and son living in Glasgow who were sort of navigating the Thatcher years and the mass unemployment that came to the city, and trying to find a place that they belong and to love each other through that tough time. And as soon as I allowed the characters on the page, they just had so much to tell me. And really I just got out of the way of them.
And the Thatcher years in Scotland, they were a time of great economic hardship, and a lot of men lost their jobs and then their sense of purpose and their pride. And it was the women and children who suffered, as in the pandemic time. It's often been women and children have suffered in hard economic times. That was the case too.
Absolutely, yes. Especially in the part of Glasgow that I come from, unemployment went to about 26% and stayed there for almost a decade. And we know when men struggle, when they have a tough time, it is women and children that suffer. But we often don't get to hear from the women and children, especially in quite a masculine patriarchy place like Glasgow. And so Shuggie stands in a way in a long literary tradition of these sort of post-industrial novels. That we think about Irvine Welsh, I think about James Kelman, I think about Alan Stiltoe. But what I wanted to do was really focus it on a mother's experience, really based on my own mother's experience, and also on a young gay man's experience in this place where masculinity is quite narrow. And just to re-look at the years, but look at how these two characters try to survive.
For your hero, Shuggie, growing up, he faces awful homophobia.
Mm.
Is that the time? Is it the geography? Is it a combination of both? Glasgow in the 1980s was a particularly awful time to be young and gay. I mean, there is an autobiographical aspect to this. Was it a particularly bad place and bad time to be? I think they say in the book, no right or something.
Yeah, they do. The homophobia that Shuggie experiences is he's just called no right. They can't quite put their finger on it, but his sensitivity and his effeminacy sort of worry the men around him and the women also. What I would say is it's not a story I think that is actually specific to Glasgow. I think this is something, and what I've learned through publishing the book is this is a story that could have been set in Naples or Detroit or Delhi. I think it comes in a time when before gay pride, before people knew that they shouldn't do things like that. And so the characters that even sort of commit homophobic acts in the book, I try to be kind with because society just didn't know better. They should have known better, but they didn't. And
but even some of it comes through a place of love. The brother,
absolutely.
the grandfather, so the grandmother, they want Shuggie to behave a little bit more like a heterosexual boy because they want him to feel better. They think the cure is for him to change his innate personality.
Yeah, and they think he can change. And actually, they make him believe that too. So Shuggie spends a lot of the book trying to learn how to walk and like a heterosexual man, how to carry himself like he perceives a normal person would, how to kick a ball. And that really is, was some of the reality of growing up gay and poor in those times. You're meant to believe that you should change and you can change. And even the people who love Shuggie in the book, you're absolutely right, want that for him because they have no way of understanding that you can be a happy gay man at that time in history, that you can go on and find a life full of love and acceptance because they just don't see it around them.
It's a historical novel in that aspect. It's about a time where we hope we've moved on from, so that a little boy growing up in Glasgow in the year 2021 maybe wouldn't face these horrors to the same extent. But then when you look at the world news and what's happening in parts of Eastern Europe, there must be probably a Shuggie in Hungary somewhere now, or in a country like that, who's facing the same situation. It made me, as a straight reader, I suppose, just think of how destructive it is when the culture led by politicians becomes homophobic.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point. I think with a lot of advancement, we think all boats rise at the same time, but there are still people being left behind, or still being punished for who they are and their souls. And actually, even in New York, one of the charities I support here is about supporting homeless queer teens who, when they come out to their families, or when they tell their mother and father that they are gay, they are evicted, they're thrown out. And so that's still happening in New York. And so we have to be mindful that progress doesn't reach everybody at the same time, at the same speed.
And you've written this story about a boy growing up in Glasgow in the 80s, feeling different because of his sexuality, and having a mother who was addicted to alcohol, and the story of her. This is also your personal story. So why did you choose a novel rather than writing a memoir of your childhood?
Actually, the novel chose itself. For it to be a work of fiction was something that the work dictated to me, because as I said earlier, as soon as I started to write this story, the characters all rushed in. People that I didn't know wanted to tell me something about the time, and it very quickly dwarfed my own experience or my own life. And I wanted to do that. The book reads often like a Greek tragedy or a Greek chorus, where Agnes and Shuggie are at the center of it, but many characters come in and comment on the social times, comment on what it meant to be a mother, or how they feel about homosexuality. And that was important for me, to create as broad a portrait as possible. Because also it's a working class novel, and there is a really powerful chorus in working class communities. We all go through very similar things at the same time. We're all, dealing with the same sort of housing issues, the same social issues, the same unemployment issues. And one of the things I wanted to show in the book was actually, it's not just Agnes as a mother who's having a difficult time. We keep zooming out and looking at other mothers and other fathers and other children who are going through very similar situations, because it was a time that was difficult for a lot of people.
And you describe this great love between a child and his mother. And there was great love between you and your mother, who you lost to addiction. Because people know that story, they're going to make parallels. They're going to think, oh, that's that's Douglas and that's his mum. And you have to write a realistic, rounded character with Agnes. Did that make it difficult when you had to include the bad parts, that you didn't feel that you were, telling the world bad things about your mum?
No, it was a really important tool for me to process the truth of the situation, because truly in loving an addict, there is good and there is bad. And the one thing I wanted to achieve with Agnes was not to reduce her to her addiction, or to have that be her personality. That can often happen in literature. That can be what the person is. And from my own experience with my own mother, I knew that the character of Agnes Bain was an incredibly complex person. She had hopes and wishes and dreams. She was an individual, a mother, a daughter, a lover, a friend, a foe. And she could be wonderful things. She's incredibly defiant and resilient and gregarious, but she's also self-sabotaging and can be very selfish and can be incredibly flawed. And so I wanted just to create as complex a portrait as possible, in the hope that it brings you as close to truth as possible.
And that complexity is important, isn't it? Because in right-wing tabloids across the world, in the UK, it would be the Daily Mail. There's an equivalent in every paper in every country. There will be this demonized single mother getting benefit payments and spending them on booze, and they become sort of hate figures in the right-wing media. At the very least, your book describes one of these demonized characters in all their humanity.
And that's exactly it. And in fact, without being demonized in the media, when I grew up in a community that saw a lot of men and a lot of women suffer with addiction. And when the men suffered with addiction, we tended to think, oh, that's what men do. He's had a hard life, and this is just dad's drink that much. When a woman suffered with addiction, first of all, it's done in private because it's not happening in pubs, it's not happening outside. But we suddenly blame the woman at the heart of it. We don't acknowledge that there might be a person suffering from hurt or from trauma there. And instead, we start to, cast her as a failure. How can you fail as a mother? How can you do that? Don't you know you're meant to be there more for your children, for your husband, for your community? And we stop to, there's so much shame and there's so much stigma there. And so, what I wanted to do with the character of Agnes Bain is show the entire spectrum of this human being. How readers come to it, how you feel about it, is entirely your own decision, and is influenced by your morals, because there are no morals in a book. There shouldn't be morals in a book. But really, it should just be a very rounded portrait of this woman who's doing her very best.
But this is, I guess, where the autobiographical aspect comes in. When you hear about a mother with this sweet child who is suffering from addiction, you kind of want her to stop. And you can imagine living close to someone with addiction and just saying, please stop, I'm here, get rid of the bottles, I'm here. What's that like? We know from doctors it's not that complicated, but it must feel as the son that you could just say, stop all that, stop, it'll be okay, there's me, you don't need that. And it can't happen. That must be so frustrating.
Yeah, it's absolutely the fallacy that a lot of children and people who love addicts live under. First of all, at the first half of the book, her mother and father believe it's just a stern talking to that Agnes needs. And if she gets that, she will suddenly straighten up and fly right. And then Shuggie, her youngest son, throughout the novel, and actually all of her children believe this to a certain point, they can keep helping her and she'll get better. And if they just keep coming back to the situation with love. And the truth is the war with addiction happens inside the addict. And it took me much of my adult life to realize my mother's struggles were not about me. How she felt about addiction and how she felt about her own life were not about how much she loved me, because she always loved me. And Shuggie, has a difficult time believing he can't save his mother. And he has many conversations with his older brother about this. He just thinks if he loves her hard and if he tries again, she will get better. And I lost my own mother at 16 to addiction. And it's something that, first of all, the loss and the grief has stayed with me my entire adult life, but also the guilt. I feel now as an adult man that I just so desperately wish I could go back as a man with all the emotional maturity I have, with all the resources I have, and be able to help my mother. But of course, it was my mother's journey and it was my mother's own struggle. And there's only so much you can do. One of the central questions of the book is, how far do you go to save the person you love before you have to save yourself? And it's a question in different ways that each of Agnes's children wrestle with.
And it's tricky with alcohol, isn't it? Because it's this kind of socially accepted drug in many ways. And Agnes is a very vivacious character. And of course, early in her life, she's a lot of fun, and a lot of fun people drink alcohol. And at one point, that relationship goes wrong. Is there a one moment, a tipping point that you would point to in Agnes's life, where it went from someone who enjoys a good drink to someone who is destroyed by alcoholism?
Actually, that's a fantastic question. And in the first couple of drafts of the book, it was a point that I actually got entirely wrong, because I was thinking about it as an outsider, and I was thinking about trauma and cause and effect. I was thinking about Agnes's marriage collapsing, and so she turns to alcohol. And what I actually had to do was go back and interview a lot of addicts, interview people who knew my own mother, and just say, when was this moment? Why didn't you stop at this moment? Why didn't you see it coming? And the truth is nobody saw it coming, because, as you say, especially in communities, I think, that enjoy alcohol, that are maybe hard drinking communities, the line between a good time and a bad time is really hard to notice. And many people slide into addiction without knowing that's where it's going. It becomes a very slow creeping thing. And so I had to go back and really rethink the book without having that one genesis moment, that one evening where everyone's like, oh, that you went too far, and instead just have it be a slow creep. And in much of what happens in the book is there's no place for sort of mental health to go, and mental sort of the compound of it. No one can really say to her, oh, you're trying to escape this situation, or you feel lonely, or you feel like your dreams aren't coming real. because we had no language to process that. We only really took it as, why are you doing this? Or why, you have so much to live for. And Agnes is a woman with so much to live for. She's beautiful, she's bright, she's incredibly popular, she's got a loving, lovely family. And yet, she is unwell.
The bad guy in the book, if you like, is the father figure, Shug.
Right.
Do we have to feel any sympathy or pity for him? Is he addicted to his unfaithfulness? He cheats on Agnes. He abandons her, but he's going around town basically being serially unfaithful. When I was reading it concurrently to the story of addiction in terms of alcohol, I wondered if his escapism was an addiction to sex. He got that rush, that feeling of self-esteem from still being desired by people with a dead-end job in a city that's quite depressed, but he got that sense of self-esteem from his sexual appeal to women.
That's exactly right. And he is also a man whose natural charms are fading. And so he likes the buzz and the thrill of these encounters with women. But the encounters are also incredibly controlling for Shug. I mean, he uses the women pretty terribly, actually. And that, I think, feeds his ego, and it also gives him some sense of worth. That he has control over something in this society where perhaps working class men don't have control over much. But I was also making a comment on how often there's not a consequence for men, how men can, at the time, could act any way they really liked and sort of get away with it in a way. I'm a child whose father sort of abandoned the family and went on to have a very happy life. But there was no social consequence for my father. He just up and he left and he was gone. And yet my mother was left behind to bear all the consequence. She both bared the consequence of social standing within the community, but also was left with a paralyzing broken heart. And so really I wanted Shug as that character to be this guy who could do these despicable things and then have, just up and leave. And also he's a taxi driver in the book, which is a twist of fiction, but that's a comment on mobility too. He roams the city, he goes wherever he wants. And yet Agnes, as his abandoned wife, is really truly rooted in the spot that she's stuck in.
I am aware when I asked this question that there's a lot of debate about how men find excuse for bad behavior from other men. But I was wondering, reading with the backdrop of the economic crisis in Glasgow and people losing their jobs, to what extent the often brutal behavior we see by many of the male characters is at least explained, if not excused, by economics. I mean, to what point do we say it's not right? We understand what the roots were. Is it important to understand that?
Actually, I don't know that that covers the whole explanation for it. I think, first of all, we're all complicit in society and we all have a contribution. One of the things that I came to understand through writing the book is that although a few of the men in the book do very selfish, harmful things, this was a time when we didn't allow men to even express themselves. Certainly in Glasgow, in the family and the community I came from, some of my family went a mile under the earth and excavated coal. Some of them made ships, some of them bent steel. And no one ever stopped to say, are you happy? Are you okay? Do you feel safe? Are you afraid? But we also never asked them to express their tenderness or their vulnerability. It was unspeakable for a man to have a female friend that was platonic, that he could go, walking hills with, or, it just was, these things in society were just not allowed. We just didn't do it, and so oftentimes the men were self-medicating by drinking too much, by going to the pub. And we saw that as an acceptable behavior because we didn't have the tools to say to them, actually, are you okay? Is there something else you want to be doing in life? Do you have other dreams? Are you hurt? And when you don't allow men to open up their masculinity, when you don't allow them to even express themselves, what if you wanted to dress differently to the other men? If you just liked the color yellow, any of these small things, if you don't allow men to open up in that way, then a lot of harm flows from it. But we are all complicit in that. And I think we have to be mindful sometimes of thinking that men are the root cause of everything in society. Certainly they have a lot of work to do, but we have to think about how we're all in this together.